Tessa, thank you so much for joining me today. It's so exciting to see you again and talk about your incredible book today. So I'm so happy you're here.
It's a pleasure, really, my pleasure. It was so nice to meet you at the festival.
You too. And I'm going to do a brief introduction because you deserve one. And so here we go. So Tessa McWatt is the author of six novels, two books for young people, and one nonfiction book. Her work has been showcased and nominated for the Governor's General Award, the Toronto Book Awards, and the OCM Bocas Prize. She's a winner of the Eccles British Library Award in 2018. Shame on Me, An Anatomy of Race and Belonging, but is actually an autobiography of her life. So I have to ask, because obviously such a varied range of books that you've written. So
Yeah.
what made you write this one in particular?
Well, I've been writing around the themes and, about race, about belonging, about, kind of othering for my whole life as a novelist. And then in 2016, when the world seemed to really shift in a public way in terms of Brexit and in terms of Trump, I just felt like I couldn't really hide behind fiction anymore. I really had to talk about the issues in the way that only I think that only I can talk about them, meaning that my very multiracial background I think has given me a particular perspective on ideas of nation and belonging and race and belonging. And so I thought I just wanted to explore that for myself because I wasn't actually sure what it was going to come out to be. So I explored it through thinking about literature, thinking about my own body, and thinking about what it meant to sort of have a racial identity.
Yeah, I loved that, because you never think of it in that perspective or in that terms that, how your body is also
Yeah,
just different in so many
yeah,
ways, and I guess it was something I'd never even thought about, like how you
yeah,
divided into eyes and then skin and things like that. And I think
yeah.
we've always had like maybe one concept of it, but you've kind of explored it in such a beautiful variation. So when you think of your varied ancestry, like
Mm,
with a lot of trauma involved as well, like what are
yeah.
your feelings around it?
It's very complicated. I think one of the things I tried to do in the book, I open the book with a kind of imaginative projection of the women that are my ancestors,
Mm.
and I try to complicate my sense of my own ancestry, having not known any of them, only knowing sort of them and stories, except for one, my grandmother I knew. So the book opens with this kind of complication of who they are, and then the essence of the journey is the question that I was asked in grade three in Toronto, which is when we were reading a book and the word Negro came up in the book, and the teacher asks everybody in the class, and I sort of snapped to it and thought, everybody in the class, what does that word mean? And I didn't know what it meant. I knew what black was, and I knew where I was from, but I didn't know. So I sort of looked around with everybody else to find the answer to that question, and then someone said, "Oh, Tessa is a Negro," and the teacher sort of tried to protect me for some reason about that, and said, "No, no, no, not Tessa. She's what are you?" She asked me, and I couldn't answer that question. I had no idea how to answer that question, not because I mean it's a ridiculous
Yeah.
question, but it's also I didn't know what she was saying. I didn't know,
Mm.
what she was meaning me to say. What are you? And I think she was trying to get something sort of a nationality out of me. And had she said that, I might have been able to say I was born in Guyana. But she just said it was what are you? So the book asks that question in terms of what, in terms of the very anatomical, physical level of what versus other questions that are about belonging.
Yeah, yeah. What a just a such a loaded question. I was like,
Yeah,
why would anyone
yeah.
ask that? That's absolutely
People ask it
crazy.
all the time.
It's
Have since
mad.
asked it a lot. What are you? And I think and I don't I think it's quite unconsciously aggressive,
Mm.
and othering, and it's just a very sort of objectifying thing to
Yeah,
say. Yeah,
absolutely. Very triggering, isn't it?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
just like, gosh, there was a really beautiful line you wrote, which was, I think, race is a story. Throughout
yeah,
history, people have enslaved others using vibrant language to justify their actions. And so, what
yeah.
do you think, like, why do you think people have actually enslaved others using this kind of language throughout history?
Well, I think anyone who's in what the book examines is positions of power. And I think power and positions of power are what create the sort of foundations of race. So race is created all the time by those people in power who want to other or dehumanize those people that they see as a threat to their power, or as a threat to their material or physical existence, or their profit, or whatever it is that they are in power and in control of. And so I think it's a lust for power. Um, I think it's a greed. I think it's very, very finely attached to capitalism and colonialism, and this idea of conquering a kind of othered society and then creating race in order to keep them in their place, which is, is below that sort of supreme level of whiteness, really.
Oh, so would you say that's the consequence of basically that language being used against people, which is essentially enslavement?
I think they work together. I think that one is I think that enslavement um, is a conscious goal, or it was a conscious goal in terms of colonial power, in that others were there to be less than
Mm.
those powers. And then I think the language becomes a useful way of keeping it alive, as it is to
Mm.
these days. Language is very, very powerful.
True.
Language is it's all we have in some ways, and so many battles are waged in language, these days on Twitter,
Yeah.
in the media, in the House of Parliament. Language is weaponized, and I
Mm.
think we have to be very aware, and this is why the book deals a lot with language and that word Negro, and the kind of way we think and talk about people. We have to be aware how weaponized language is and can be, and it's always changing, and we're always making new ways of dominating. People are always making new ways of dominating others through their use of language. And so the book focuses on that as a very important part of my understanding of belonging, and my understanding of what race is.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, you're right. At this time, so much, talk about misinformation and things like that.
Yeah,
And my
yeah,
God,
yeah.
it's so true.
and
It's
we and we and we take language very seriously, and I think it's right that we take it seriously, but it's also, we have to recognize the very fluid, very creative, and very, who has the language ends up being in power. Who
mm,
has the means, has the press, who has the ability to control those words that are going around, um, is a very powerful thing.
100%. And the sloganism and things like that people are
Yeah,
using, the sloganeering, and for example, some of the words that our well, soon to be former Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said in his own
yeah,
writings says a lot about how people are
yeah,
even still think now, which is horrifying. But
yeah.
so how do you think we can actually change these kind of mindsets to understand like race is a construct and not a reality?
Yeah, it's very difficult because race is also a reality. It's a construct, but in the street, if you're a Black person walking down the street and looking suspicious, whatever that means, it's a reality. So it's very hard to separate those things. And I think that the thing that the book that I want to do in the book is raise it as a concept, and raise it as a construct of power, for
Mm.
sure, but also to acknowledge that for racialized people, it is a very real and very painful and very destructive and violent thing, and continues to be. But that a lot of time race gets made and remade. And so I think, one of the things that capitalism does really well is that it's sort of taken some sort of ideas of representation into its jaws and swallowed it whole. And so you have people who are racialized but still having power, and therefore not acknowledging that the inequality is around racialized otherness, but it's kind of disguised because a few people can run for prime minister as a racialized person. So that they're or that billionaire musicians can have their popular songs at #1 for a long time. So it's a kind of illusion of justice. It's not justice.
It's not. No, it really isn't.
Yeah.
And you talk a lot about belonging in the book, of course. And so is belonging something given to you or something you create?
My whole life I have struggled with belonging. And I think in my first book, my first novel, Out of My Skin, I have a character saying, belonging is something you give yourself. And I think ultimately that it would be what we should be doing. But it's very difficult when you feel like you don't know where to stand. You don't know where to be or place the center of yourself, because we're all contained multitudes. We all have many potential areas where we could belong. But belonging is also, if someone claims you, or if you claim a nation state or a football team or whatever it is that you feel like you want to belong to, they all have ideologies attached to them, those kinds of group ideologies or those greater nationalistic ideologies, and they don't necessarily represent a person. And so I think in terms of choosing where you feel that you most belong, I think is a very powerful thing to adopt particularly as a racialized person.
Yeah, no, 100%, to be able to put yourself in different situations and say that I have a right, or I have a right to this space, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah. And that it's a potentially creative thing. Like, I say that I'm really interested in unbelonging. I'm interested in this sense that I don't belong really in any one place, and that offers me and I'm very lucky to have that scope, and that I have a lot of privilege that allows me to belong many places rather than one place. And not everybody has that, obviously, but I think there's, for me, a lot of creativity in sort of embracing unbelonging.
Yeah, no, you're right, because I guess you've been able to sort of travel to so many places, and then just kind of put yourself in places and just learn, I guess, from all these different situations as well, as a way, which is incredible as well, to use that material as well for your writing. So, but when you have like these kind of gaps in your history, like, do you think it's more difficult to make up stories, or is it easier?
I don't know. I mean, I have huge gaps, and yet I have also a kind of core belonging to my imagination, and to other writers, and to people around the world who are struggling for social justice. And I have a kind of international belonging that doesn't have to do with place. And so there are places to help me with my storytelling. There's a whole sort of political camaraderie with people who are struggling and resisting in the same kinds of things that I am. And so there are stories available for us. And I think so the individual isn't as important in that case. I think I find a way to belong sort of in that world, and so therefore I have the stories that I can identify with as well.
Yeah, no, the beautiful stories as well. Just so fascinating because you're also learning so much about
Yeah,
the world
exactly.
around you.
And how much, many of us who racialized people in particular, many of us who identify with, our desires for social justice and for, kind of resistance. It's a beautiful place.
Mhm.
It's a place with hope.
Yeah, no, it really is actually. It's
Yeah.
just, and then also just because where you are now in comparison to say where some of the ancestors were, it's just
Yes.
like, wow,
Yes.
we've
Exactly.
managed to move on so much.
Exactly. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I'm still here, and I have a kind of responsibility to those ancestors. I think that's why I started the book with them. I feel like,
Mm.
I'm here because of them, and they didn't have those voices.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of my responsibility to give them a voice on the page.
Yeah, 100%. And
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing is that we carry around so much of this kind of racialized baggage, and so how much do you think we've actually absorbed, as we go on generation to generation?
Do you mean like how much we take on the racialization? Yeah,
Yeah, the
totally, totally.
baggage and
And the colonial attitudes, I had to I had to, I think we all do have to, like, drag myself out from under all of this colonial self-hatred
Mhm.
that I had as a young person. And that's kind of also what the book is about, how to it took me a long time to there are all those things about decolonizing the self
Mm.
first before you can decolonize anything else, and I think that's a big task, because how I was educated had to be um, reckoned with, actually.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because,
Yeah.
even in our minds now, a lot of us will assume that we're minorities, but actually we're part of the global
Global
majority.
majority, absolutely.
And
Which is the
still,
phrase I'm on, the only phrase I'm using these days for for us.
honestly,
So
yeah,
yeah,
it's crazy, but you forget because, there's that viewpoint that,
yeah,
when you're in a country like in the UK, for example, where
yeah,
you're always considered a minority, it's just like
yeah, yeah.
actually very, very different
Yeah,
situation.
exactly. And it's one of the things that I deal with in the book, which is, the structure of, we are structurally, the metaphor that I use is a plantation. So there's the,
Mm.
the whiteness in the plantation house and the others in the field, and in various points of history. And I think one of the things that I think about whiteness is that lots of people can have whiteness as a mentality, but that what it does is it maintains that structure. It's the structural racism and the structural inequality that is the issue. So even if we have sort of individual notions of freedom from racialization, structurally we are absolutely still bound in that kind of plantation structure.
Yeah, no, 100%. It's quite shocking to think that, after all these like centuries,
Yeah.
not that much has changed. And I wanted to ask this,
No.
what is true identity if, how do we find it without the primordial white narrator, as you say?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, That's a really good question. I think maybe we shouldn't look at it as identity. I
Mm.
think we should look at it as authenticity rather than identity. Like, instead of naming what I see my identity as, I want to live in the world in an authentic way, and whatever that means. I'm not sure. I think sometimes with identity politics, the whiteness loves identity politics, because while we're all arguing about who we are and how much of this we have in us and how much of that, and what we are trying to, I mean, I'm not saying it's irrelevant, because it's grouping together is important to kind of get consciousness.
Mm.
But while we're kind of worried about that, the tanks are rolling in. That
Yeah.
the planet is being destroyed,
Mm.
by those people who I say their mentality is about whiteness because it's about extraction and it's about power and it's about inequality as fundamental to their way of work and their way of being in the world, and the life that is based on a profit margin. And I think I think identity might not be as important in under those circumstances, and that being the book also ends with this a different kind of question, which is who are you rather than what are you. And I think, who are you in the face of climate catastrophe? Who are you in the face of structural racism? Who are you in the face of migrants drowning in the Mediterranean? Who are you in the face of anti-Blackness in the street every single day? And so that's what I mean by authenticity rather than identity. So it's this constant examining of your positionality in the world and that truth to whatever political position you believe in, whether that's based on your ethnicity or it's based on your sexuality or gender identification, whatever it is. I think that's part of it. And then there's all the other stuff, about your authenticity.
Yeah, God, 100%. That's really beautiful. I'm glad you answered that because I was really curious, especially after the book.
Yeah.
Like, I wonder if you've got like a cohesive self after all of that exploration into your life.
I don't know if we ever have a cohesive self. I think maybe when we die, we've reached some place of finality but I think that's good. I think the growth is absolutely crucial. And I think back to the point of authenticity, I think authenticity could be the thing like we circle around as we go through life, and that maybe if we just keep coming back to that, then that's the cohesion. That's the reality, is more of an impulse than a something static. I don't think I'll ever be a thing that's finished. I think I'm still in progress.
I think we all are. And so thank you, Tessa, so much for speaking with me today. It was just such a pleasure and always so enlightening because it's so beautiful, the prose in your book as well. And it just kind of really transports this kind of question so much into so many different areas. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Real pleasure to know you and to talk to you today.
You too.